Previously on Ice Cold Case.
Detective Cruz.
Hi, this is Madison.
They listen to everything I'm saying on this phone right now. All this shit being recorded.
I was advised you have a podcast. I don't want to be on your podcast or get recorded or anything.
I mean, I'm a family member first.
So, what we're doing now is digging up everything we can about the youngest cold case we have in Belmont County, and that's the J.C. McGee from 2002.
So, we're working on that and resubmitting some things to the lab because, technologies have changed. We want to talk to Omar again. Do you ever talk to him? Do you know him?
The expose starts now. The longer I stare at the details of this case, the more it feels like theories pop up out of nowhere. A whack-a-mole of suspects and possibilities. I'm sure that's inevitable after years of staring at the same puzzle pieces, turning them over, trying to make them fit. Eventually, your brain starts drawing connections between dots you swore you'd already crossed off. I've been spiraling down this rabbit hole for years now, chasing shadows and possibilities, and still, even with my head spinning and the information feeling like it's been shoved through a meat grinder, a few theories cling tighter than others. When I first started down this road, I was given advice that sounded simple at the time. Go for the low-hanging fruit. Don't overcomplicate it. Look for the obvious theory and start there. Occam's razor became the principle that I kept going back to, which is the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best one. And in my dad's case, there's one explanation that's hard to ignore. The possibility that he was killed because he was a confidential informant. Now, if you've ever lived in a small town, you know how fast secrets spread. But in Belmont County, it's not just gossip about who's dating or who bought a new truck. It's much deeper. People whisper about drug deals and dirty money. In a place where everyone seems to know everyone else's business, the label snitch is more than just an insult. It's a target. It's dangerous. Being called a snitch here isn't just about losing friends or respect. Sure, snitches get stitches. But in my dad's case, did it get him killed? It's no secret that some people matter less in this country. That's always been the case, especially when it comes to our institutions of power. I don't feel crazy when I assume that my father's case was taken less seriously because he was a black man, and more specifically, a black man involved with drugs. There's just so much proof that this case was not investigated well. And I won't rehash it all again, but just to summarize, the crime scene was not properly taped off, witnesses weren't interviewed, and ultimately, their attempts to solve this case were underwhelming. But even beyond the specific facts of what happened to J.C. McGee, there are undeniable patterns of behavior when it comes to victims like my dad. The insulation drug-related violence has is strong because police departments keep their distance. They're the first to target drug dealers for arrest, but often the last to care if the violence turns deadly. After the brutal, caught-on-camera beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1991, the LAPD was under a microscope. What the public learned in the aftermath was chilling. Officers had an unofficial code for certain victims. They call them NHI cases. NHI stands for No Humans Involved. If you were a victim who fell into that category, people of color, sex workers, gang members, drug users, police literally labeled you as non-human. Think about that. Your murder file could be reduced to 3 letters that meant, in essence, not worth our time. And Los Angeles is far from the only city where this kind of dismissive dehumanization occurred. Another famous instance where the police's perception of the victim impacted the outcome of anyone even pretending to do their jobs actually let a serial killer get away with a multi-decade crime spree. Samuel Little, who some experts later regarded as the most prolific murderer in American history, has confessed to 93 murders, according to the FBI. Many of Little's victims were sex workers and women of color, and he later told investigators he actually chose who to kill based on who he knew police cared about the least. In New York, police also used the term NHI. Filmmaker Joe Berlinger's Netflix documentary, Crime Scene: The Times Square Killer, looks at how NYPD's dismissal of the murders of people using and selling drugs and often involved in sex work let killers run amok. Our friend Paul Weird-Gartner, the retired FBI agent that I recently spoke to, also had a term for the killings of people police considered undesirable: misdemeanor homicides.
When they had 3,000 murders a year in New York, many of which was all remained unsolved. There was a term they used to call them sometimes misdemeanor homicides, like they just one drug dealer killing another. That actually they killed so many of each other that there's some evidence that actually is responsible for the subsequent decrease in crime rate, and it really wasn't the law enforcement that did it. It was a lot of them were killed off. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but unfortunately, it's human nature. So if you have an innocent child that was murdered, the people are going to be a lot more interested in pulling out all the stops to do that than if they think someone is a bad guy.
I can't say for sure if the detectives who arrived on the scene of my dad's murder had this exact mindset. It's hard to get into their thinking when the Belmont County Sheriff's Office is dodging most of my questions. But when you look at the context of his killing in 2002, it's not hard to draw some assumptions about the culture in rural Ohio at the time.
They're going to, probably say, like the sheriff's department, they ain't done nothing. They look at it, in this day and age, they'll probably say, they look at another black man off the street and all that, which is not true. Not true. It doesn't matter if that person's black, white, green, yellow, whatever. I look at it the same, okay? They're probably going to tell you we ain't done nothing.
According to the 2000 U.S. Census, in Belmont County, there were 66,698 white people and 2,553 black people, respectively accounting for 94% and 4% of the total population. Those numbers were relatively similar in 2010 and 2020. So already, we know that my dad was killed in a predominantly white area. But there's another detail about that data that is even more important. Of the black people living in Belmont County in 2000, half of those people were incarcerated. That's right. Of the 2,553 black residents, 1,222 were in jail or prison, compared to the 891 white people incarcerated of the 66,698 residents. This means that half of the black people that Belmont County law enforcement is interacting with are already incarcerated in the Belmont Correctional Institution or the Belmont County Jail. Did the police arrive at my dad's crime scene and, as Paul so plainly put it, think this was just another case of one drug dealer killing another? I mean, we already somewhat know that the cops assumed this about the case based on Detective Duvall's own words.
Again, that's all they were doing. Drug dealers were all drug dealers, knowing the victims weren't going to call.
True that. You can go a long way in this country killing black folk. Young males especially. Misdemeanor homicides.
Marlo was killing white women.
White children. Tourists.
One white ex-cheerleader tourist missing an Aruba.
Trouble is, this ain't Aruba, bitch.
You think that if 300 white people were killed in this city every year, they wouldn't send the 82nd Airborne? Negro, please.
That clip you just heard is from Season 5, Episode 2 of The Wire. And if you know anything about that show, you know, while it was fiction rooted in an ugly truth. Watching that scene in 2008, the characters are talking about Baltimore. But listening to it now, it feels uncomfortably close to home for me and to J.C. McGee's case. Those fictional characters are really talking about what gets attention and what doesn't in the real world, whose life is worth the paperwork and whose isn't. Before my podcast, there was basically no media coverage about my dad's case. To put it bluntly, nobody gave a fuck. But when you strip away the details, you don't mention Belmont County, don't mention race, this story is shocking. It's a jaw-dropping plotline. A father shot in his own home while his kid is home in the daylight of a summer morning in front of witnesses. There's a crime scene with traceable evidence. This case should not have been hard to solve. But once you look back at the reality, a Black man with a history of drug involvement in a predominantly white county, suddenly the indifference makes sense. But don't just take it from me and my own personal experience. This is a common theme across homicide investigations.
Well, you know, with cold cases and shit, like, they're cold for a reason. The detective work and shit like that, this, that, and the third, either was faulty when you have all this coming from Omar. They didn't follow up on it. You know why? It's just another nigga.
I know, it's a big topic and nobody wants to hear me ramble about racial injustice for any longer. I'm not trying to tackle the systemic racism in Belmont County in just this little podcast, but the reality is you can't talk about the J.C. McGee case and ignore the reality of the circumstances surrounding his murder and the handling of this investigation. This is the bias that shapes investigations, and it's not always written in the reports. People refer to it as bias-induced data. You let your own bias impact how you report or research something, and it impacts the data to make it affirm your own ideas. Sometimes the negative impact is in what actually gets ignored. I've started thinking of it as vibe-based data, because when you look at the paper trail, you can see it. Cases get sorted based on what the investigator believes was their vibe, who the victim was, how they looked, what they did, and whether the people in power could imagine themselves in their shoes. This is why representation matters. It always has. We trust people more easily when we see ourselves in them. If you're a prosecutor or a detective and the victim looks like you, has kids the same age as yours, lives in a neighborhood like yours, you lean in. You care more. Belmont County's current entire prosecutorial team has no Black members. 0. So when a case touches the Black community, the only people in positions of power to fight for justice are the people who don't share that lived experience. Now, that doesn't automatically make them malicious, but it does make them harder to empathize. And this isn't just about Belmont County. Bias is everywhere. It's in the shrug when someone brings up racial injustice. It's in the roots of policing itself, in the way cases get worked. Sometimes the bias is so strong, it shapes what investigators even think is possible. Racial bias has saturated every aspect of law enforcement, not just for victims, but also for perpetrators of crime. Listen to how insane this is. For a very long time, the FBI did not think that Black men were sophisticated enough to be serial killers. Yeah, Black people were more likely to get away with it solely because they were underestimated. Let me be clear. Anyone can be a serial killer. Look at the previous example, Samuel Little, who I mentioned is now considered one of the most prolific serial killers. He was able to get away with killing so many people because, yes, his victims were not highly regarded by society, but he too was a Black man. For a long time, police were not looking at someone like him as capable of pulling that off. In an article from The Root, a news outlet that offers news, commentary, and cultural analysis from a variety of Black perspectives, Lynette Holloway dissects the absolutely wild phenomenon in her article, which is titled, "Of Course There Are Black Serial Killers." I'd recommend just reading the article, but I will summarize it for you. She starts out by talking about Lonnie Franklin Jr. You might know him as the Grim Sleeper, a serial killer charged with 10 murders in Los Angeles. An interesting angle it made her consider how people usually picture serial killers as these smart white men. The media paints them like masterminds. But the article pointed out that the stereotype isn't necessarily true. The FBI doesn't keep statistics on serial killers by race, and they've said that serial killers exist across every racial group in about the same proportions as the overall population. But experts say that the media tends to underreport cases involving Black serial killers, which created this myth that they're somehow rare or don't exist. And in all the ways that Black people are notably treated differently in the criminal justice system, here's a weird fact that Louis B. Schlesinger, a forensic psychologist, said flat out. That idea is a total myth. Black serial killers have always existed. They've just been ignored by coverage. Paul Cellino, a longtime Chicago area private investigator, noted that racism definitely plays into it because the media hasn't historically viewed Black people as clever enough to be serial killers, instead pushing the stereotype of Black communities only being tied to street and gang violence. And that's another myth, that serial killers are somehow highly intelligent. Most actually fall in the average or low average IQ range. The ones who avoid capture for a long time are labeled as geniuses, when in fact, the reality is they're often just targeting people who are vulnerable, like sex workers or people struggling with addiction, and that makes it harder for law enforcement to connect the dots, and their social status of the victim makes the police feel less compelled to do something. You know, those are considered the misdemeanor murders. And in Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s case, that's exactly what happened. For more than 2 decades, he lived in the community, came off like a friendly neighbor, and at the same time was killing women who weren't closely connected to him. He blended into society, which is pretty common for serial killers. So the big takeaway for me confirmed what we were all speculating, but now have a larger sample size. The stereotypes in true crime can be deadly. The theory of the brilliant white male serial killer is both inaccurate and rooted in bias. Serial killers exist across all races, and the ones we don't hear about, like Franklin, say as much about our blind spots as they do about the crimes themselves. And that bias is only amplified when it comes to the victims of crime. Beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the standard you need in a courtroom to convict someone of murder. But for me, it's also the standard I wrestle with in my head every time I circle back to my dad's case. Because the truth is, it's almost impossible to reach that kind of certainty when so many different theories are still on the table. The one theory that's always hovered near the surface is that my dad was targeted because he was a confidential informant. And on paper, it makes sense. He was working with law enforcement, and in communities like Belmont County, that's enough to put a target on your back. But here's the complicated part. Those closest to the game, those who have lived it, will tell you that being a CI isn't all that rare. In fact, it's practically built into the system. The drug world runs on deals. Get caught, flip. Trade names for leniency. Stay out of jail by putting someone else in. It's a vicious cycle, and it's a means that a lot of dealers, more than the average person would ever imagine, end up cooperating with police at some point. Which raises the question, if so many people are informants, why would being one automatically lead to my dad's murder? Belmont County isn't just some quiet rural stretch of Ohio. It sits at a crossroads of major highways, with easy access to Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Columbus, and all the way down into West Virginia. Drug deals don't just trickle in here. They move in volume. And where there are large drug flows, there are deals being made in backrooms, courthouses, and sheriff's offices. Some people get breaks. Some people get burned. And unless you're on the inside, it's impossible to know who's playing which side. My cousin Rico, who spent much of his life locked up or entangled in this very system, knows that reality better than most.
Like I said, man, 97% of that town worked for the federal government.
Now, he doesn't literally mean everyone in town has a government badge. What he's saying is that's how saturated the informant culture is. Nearly everyone touched by the drug trade has some kind of tie to law enforcement. You can't tell who's loyal to whom because almost everyone's working some angle. And in that environment, trust is a fragile, dangerous thing. Before we zoom out to the bigger picture, let's sit with the question, why does someone become a confidential informant in the first place?
I think primarily it is because they get in trouble themselves and they're looking for a way to help their own current situation. So if they get busted with, the classic example, someone gets busted with drugs, And, hey, we want to know who your supplier is, and that's how they become a confidential informant. We'll talk to the DA, we'll give you a break, we'll talk to the U.S. attorney.
Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's self-preservation. And sometimes it's money.
A lot of law enforcement agencies pay confidential informants. FBI informants have paid upwards of $20 million a year.
And then there's the more complicated side. Personal grudges, rivalries, or even revenge. Paul pointed to the infamous Whitey Bulger case in Boston, an Irish mobster who acted as an FBI informant for years. Bulger used his CI status not to help clean up crime, but to rat out his competition while continuing his own murders and rackets. In the end, it wasn't justice. It was corruption that stained the entire bureau. Paul's point is clear. There's no one reason someone becomes a CI. It can be desperation, self-interest, money, or manipulation. But what all those roads lead to is the same destination: a system where truth, loyalty, and safety are all negotiable. The system that relies on informants is broken, and it's broken in ways that make people like my dad incredibly vulnerable. The American Civil Liberties Union has documented this for years. Their research shows that police often exploit informants, dangling deals, threatening charges, or promising leniency to get what they want. The problem? There's rarely oversight. Informants can lie, exaggerate, or invent details to save themselves, and the police don't always require proof before acting on it. The incentives are stacked. If you're facing prison, why wouldn't you tell officers exactly what they want to hear, true or not? And it gets darker. The ACLU warns that when informants are struggling with drug addiction or mental illness, they're even more easily manipulated. Police can push back on them into unsafe situations, even criminal activity, because the system values information more than the informant's life. In some cases, departments have literally fabricated informants who have never existed at all. Think about that. The state inventing a snitch just to justify an arrest. This isn't just a theory. It's a documented practice. Harvard law professor Alexandria Notopoff has written extensively on this, and she puts it bluntly. Justice is a negotiation. 95% of convictions in the U.S. come from plea deals, not trials. Everything is up for grabs. Anything can be bargained. And as Notopoff says, it's an all bets are off space where the most serious crimes can be worked off, and conversely, where the most vulnerable people can be pressured into risking their lives. The state can promise almost anything: money, immigration benefits, better prison conditions, or most famously, leniency. They can let an informant keep committing crimes in exchange for cooperation. They can even make what's called a wired plea, where you cooperate to help a family member or a partner get a deal. There are virtually no limits. That's what makes the system so corrosive. It tells entire communities, often Black and low-income communities, that justice isn't about fairness. It's about what you can bargain for. If you have something useful, everything's on the table. And if you don't, you're disposable. And that's exactly the environment men like my dad, Daryl, and Rico were living in. Communities over-policed for drugs, flooded with informants, and treated as if their lives were a bargaining chip. Notopoff calls this the terrible, cynical, hypocritical message that law enforcement sends. We will punish you harshly when you commit a crime, but we will turn around and say your suffering is negotiable if you help us catch someone else. This isn't a big city issue. This isn't even a Belmont County issue. Throw a rock in this country and you're likely to hit a police department that runs on confidential informants. Every time that system is abused, it creates more injustice, more violence, and more vulnerability. For me, that's a bitter pill to swallow. Even if I prove my dad was killed because he was an informant, that doesn't make him unique. It makes him one more casualty of a system that asks people to risk their lives for the state without ever guaranteeing their safety in return. Being a drug dealer meant they could shrug at the murder of J.C. McGee and file it away as just another statistic. And being a snitch, that's the trifecta. As Daryl explained it to me, the streets have their own code.
The street code. Anybody that violates that code of ethics, if you was in the streets and shit and you turn snitch, they don't give a fuck about you. You're just a rat.
Snitches don't get sympathy. Not from the streets, not from law enforcement, not even from the wider community, which leaves people like my dad caught in the middle, vulnerable on all sides, and ultimately disposable. And that's where I was stuck for so long, staring at a police department that didn't care, witnesses who wouldn't talk, and a case that seemed permanently frozen. But then, for the first time in years, something shifted. I got a call from the Belmont County Sheriff's Department letting me know that a new detective was assigned to my dad's case. Fresh eyes, new energy. I felt like maybe the wall of silence could start to crack. It was a rare moment of relief, like something was going to change. For the first time in a long time, maybe all the years of waiting for someone to finally care were about to have significant impact because this was a person who could actually do something. As I mentioned earlier, they finally assigned detective crews to my dad's case, but I refuse to let that be the end of the conversation or the conclusion, because the real questions are, why now? Why wait more than 20 years? And is this new interest genuine or just damage control? When I saw the article from local outlet Lead News titled Revisiting Cold Cases in Belmont County Part 2, my gut twisted. On one hand, this is the kind of media attention this case desperately needed. On the other hand, why did it take this much public pressure for anything to stir? That article feels more like a public defense of the Belmont County Sheriff's Department than an urgency to solve this case.
Sheriff James Suzak directed us to dig into our cold case files when we have time, putting a modern eye on them to see what facts and evidence we might be able to turn up.
When we have time? That phrase leapt off the page. It suggests these cold cases were background noise until someone called attention to them. It tells me this was never a priority, not until I began making some noise. Even though Detective Duvall claims he thinks about this case at least once a week.
In my career, this case here is one I want to solve. Right hand of God, look you in the eye, I look you in the eye. I have done everything I can with this. I want to find the man who murdered your dad. That is part of what I want to do in my career. When I retire, I solve this case.
They mention another high-profile case, the double murder of a local couple in 2021, that they spent 3.5 years working on and eventually solved.
We spent 3.5 years working on a Strusen case. The heavy lifting is finally finished, and that means we do have time on some days to dig in.
The implication is, we were busy, but now we're less busy. But if your workload is the barrier to justice, that's a failure of resource allocation. A county that can spend 3.5 years on one case but can't commit to others sends a message about what it values. And then the article said this about my dad's case.
We've started examining the file from the very beginning, and we'll continue to the end. We've already connected the investigators who worked the case back then. They're all retired, but they've agreed to meet us so they can give us their opinions on the case.
I want those conversations to happen. I want the police to comb through the file, dig for anything new, speak with old officers. That's why I did all of this and made this podcast and spent all my life savings and begged you to care. Like clockwork, once there was national exposure, once someone said, hey, this case has gotten attention, suddenly the sheriff's office is putting a modern eye on things. Suddenly the cold case unit has time. Suddenly they agreed to revisit a 2002 case file. Suddenly they reached out to retired investigators. That sequence tells me one thing loud and clear. They felt pressure. And you know what? Good. But I'm not naive. I know institutions protect themselves first. I've seen it before. A fresh detective might be exactly what the case needed, but they also might be a shield, a smokescreen, or a gesture to deflect criticism. I can't ignore that the timing is suspicious. Let me pull in a few other names from Lead News to show you the pattern. Belmont County has more than 20 cold case homicides on record. Some of those names are no longer household names, but each represents a family still waiting. The piece mentions that detectives are now working to reduce the number in the near future. If that's the plan, Waiting until someone with a microphone says their name should never be the trigger for cops to take action. Is late better than never when time is the most important resource in investigations? And who is holding anyone accountable? Next time on Ice Cold Case.
And then I've seen the shoes, but you know what I mean? You just second guess yourself. You know, you don't really want to believe it.
I know the FBI maintains a shoe database. They might even be able to tell you what model of a Nike it was.
At that time, DNA was all new.
Thanks for listening to Ice Cold Case, a Yes podcast, recorded in Los Angeles at Spotify Studios. This episode was written, posted, produced, and edited by Madison McGee. Produced, copy-edited, and additional research by Ofeli Garcia-Lawler. Sound engineering and sound design by Shan McMullen. Graphic design by AJ Christensen. All outside sources are linked in the show notes. A video version is available on our YouTube channel, and a transcript is available at icecoldcase.com. To submit any tips or information, please email us at icecoldcasepodcast@gmail.com.